Welcome back to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're in part 3 of part 2. So our third take on this of trying to get through this chapter. It is the longest chapter in the book of Nancy Pearcey's Finding Truth, 5 Principles for Unmasking Atheism, Secularism, and Other God Substitutes. And right now we're on the part where we're supposed to identify the reduction that a non-Christian worldview brings into and establishes an idol, and then it dehumanizes humanity in some aspect. And so we've already covered materialism, and we just started postmodernism, and now we get to the fun part of really critiquing postmodernism. What does it say? And we're also going to be covering pantheism and Islam, and the good old ones that all philosophy has to deal with, which is Nazism and communism. So we're going to take a look at what each of these brings to the table as far as we've already kind of identified, what it's replacing God as, and then we'll kind of cover how it dehumanizes humanity and something that Christianity doesn't do. And then we'll kind of talk a little bit about kind of what these worldviews offer. It's not all bad. So we're in the midst of going over what postmodernism has claimed, and it kind of has taken the opposite approach of what materialism has done, which says that the physical world is all that there is, and this is kind of saying, well, there are areas of the mind, the non-physical thing that the Romanticists brought out and have said we haven't focused on enough, so much so that they've kind of said the things aren't really the things. Right.
So they focus on the mind. So all of this comes out of the Enlightenment period. So materialism comes out of Enlightenment. Romanticism is kind of a reaction to the Enlightenment thing, right? So Enlightenment focused on physical things. Romanticism, as she mentions, focus on mind or spirit and that sort of thing. And so that's where postmodernism kind of got its start out of the Romantic movement.
Right. So. And so we see that the Romantic era has moved from an idealism through a series of successors, which Nancy Pearcey is not going to take time to discuss here, but it gives birth to this postmodernism. The irony is that Romanticism was embraced to counter Enlightenment reductionism. Postmodernism has become equally reductionist and inhumane. And so that's what we're going to identify. So the rules that define acceptable ways to speak current today's, and as 2020, we're kind of in the midst of it more now so than ever, which is odd because the political divide seems to be everyone chanting that they have truth on their side, but it seems that within the scope of academics, within the scope of kind of the popularization of what is coming out of secondary education, truth seems to be kind of on the back burner. And so that's what postmodernism kind of focuses on. They focus on race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual identity, so on. So kind of the big 3 are race, class, and gender. And so if you have heard critical race theory, that tends to be what this kind of stems from. So I don't necessarily know if people would identify themselves so much more now as postmodernists, but they would kind of probably focus on feminist theory or gender politics theory or what have you. So those are kind of key terms to pique your ears if you're listening for what worldview is someone espousing from this. And so postmodernism virtually defines a person's identity in terms of what group he or she belongs to.
So that's an interesting point there, right?
So where materialism kind of focuses on the inner person as far as on the outer world,
right?
And the things that are out there, and you're just one of many things.
Right.
Postmodernism says reflect inward, but at the same time, you're not individual within yourself. You are part of your race group or your sexual identity group, or however you define that. Right. And so whether or not you actually fit those things, can be hashed out even more, so much so that you see people who are identify as females, and then you have people who identify as females that don't wear makeup, as being a bifurcation within these groups to kind of get as detail specific as possible to see who falls on the spectrum of being influenced against by society at large. Right. And so so the absolute mind that Hegel, or the spirit that Hegel is kind of known for, it expresses itself through community's laws, morality, language, social relationships, and so on. He took Kant's idealism, in which the world is constituted by consciousness, but for him it was a collective consciousness. So you aren't really kind of a person here; you are part of a collective.
That's right.
Kind of Borg-like. Continuing on our Star Trek theme, the absolute mind
part
creates
of your
the
community.
Yeah, the absolute mind creates the world through the shared aspects of culture, society, and things like the above shared language. Hegel's individuals do not have original ideas of their own. Their thoughts are merely expressions of the absolute mind. So here you have kind of collectivism, communism, viewed not so much on a economic scale, but on a social scale, which is something that people like Lenin and for a lesser extent probably Marx would also agree would happen as well. While Marx was probably more focused on the economics of it, you had Lenin that probably viewed more societal change like this. So over time, Hegel's pantheism was secularized for his absolute spirit and reduced to a metaphor, the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist, that they are not producers of culture so much as products of a particular culture. And so who moves culture is kind of up in the air as far as where these ideas come from. Individuals are shaped by the communities they belong to, each with its own shared perspectives, values, habits, language, and forms of life. Individuals are little more than mouthpieces for communities based on race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual identity. Postmodernism absolutizes the forces of culture and community. Truth, then, has been redefined as a social construction so that every community has its own view of truth based on its experience and perspective, which cannot be judged by anyone outside the community.
Yeah, so the community in this instance then becomes the idol for postmodernism, right? The community, the culture, perhaps, something like that. Right? Yeah. And so that's what the focus is on.
Yeah, so this moves more I think in line with where we're at with postmodernism today. I think before there was kind of a general idea that postmodernism just talks about how you have these different cultures, and these cultures, you can't really say that they're wrong. Their beliefs are just, what their culture has told them. And so for you to judge, this society that hasn't had access to Western technology as native or as savage or whatever terminology that you want to hammer down on them would be, you're just viewing it through your own Western perspective or your own white perspective or your own whatever, pick your bifurcation of what you aren't as opposed to that. And so
usually the privileged portion of society, though, are the ones that are picked on, right?
Right.
Not necessarily the folks who are not privileged.
Yeah. Although it's always odd because it always seems like people are just speaking against those who claim to have the privilege, which seems to argue against their ideas. So for postmodernism, it is a form of anti-realism, the doctrine that reality depends for its character and possibly even its existence on our own minds. So that's kind of the Matrix type ideal there. Is we all form this collective of a giant battery, and our processing power is what determines what the view of reality is. And our good old friend Nietzsche is the one that coined the term anti-realism to describe his own views, and it's summed up to the slogan that there are no facts, only interpretations of those things.
Right.
And so reality has become a mere bunch of desperate and changing interpretations, a shifting loosely held coalition of points of view in continual debate with each other. Right. So again, there's no truth. You're just kind of continuing on in this stream of ever-changing values.
Right. It's how your community interprets things.
Right.
It's basically, and that's relativism as well, right? Because it's relative to a particular truth or your intersubjective agreement, is the way Rotary put it, is determined by how your particular community interprets what's going on.
Yeah. So usually in a debate, the charge is made, well, you're just moving the goalpost, or look what was okay to espouse as a belief about whatever underprivileged group back, 5-10 years ago, that can't be done today because those values have shifted. Kind of like how you can't, step in the same lake twice. Postmodernism says there's no unified self. Instead, the self is simply the locus of shifting points of view. In reaction, postmodernism tethers individuals' consciousness tightly to communities whose perspective is conditioned by history and geography. So again, how you draw those lines is up to whoever wants to argue those points. There's no set fact, and that's part of the fact of postmodernism is there's no set facts. Ever since the golden calf of modernism is not considered true in any universal sense, like all other forms of knowledge, science is a social construction too. Postmodernists agree with Nietzsche, who wrote, all that conformity to law which oppresses us so much in the stars and in chemical processes coincides as at bottom with those properties which we bring to things. So again, it's very us dependent. So we're very kind of godlike in that respect. If science is just another creation of the human mind, why should it be granted any special status over other ways of thinking? And if no objective or universal truth is out there, then any claim to have objective truth will be treated as nothing but an attempt by one interpretive community to impose its own limited subjective perspective on everyone else. An act of oppression, a power grab. However,
so each community's views are equally plausible, and so you shouldn't try to impose your particular community's views on another community, right?
Again, a universal standard that should be done for all types of these. So we'll get to that.
Yeah. So her next section in this has to do with the roots of political correctness, right? And she indicates that postmodernism does get some things right. And so she gives us a list of 2 or 3 of them here. She says it has done good service in countering the lonely individualism of the Enlightenment's autonomous self, right? It rejects the modernist project of thinkers like Bacon and Descartes to start history over from scratch within the isolated individual consciousness. It denies that we can reach an infallible foundation for knowledge by direct intuition into the contents of the individual's mind. And so she says, in the process, postmodernisms have debunked Enlightenment claims to neutral, timeless, value-free knowledge, right? So there is, people have a perspective, and they do, right? And so that needs to be taken into account. And so postmodernism has raised that particular issue to help us to understand that. They insist that the real living individual always brings to the table a complex view of prior commitments, interests, goals, and ambitions, even in fields like science, where objectivity is the expected norm. Right.
And this is something that we would say as people that would say that worldviews play a huge interest in how we interpret facts or what we bring to the table, and they just kind of go a bit step further than what we would. But having an idea that you can't just say, okay, well, we'll start from a neutral position. We would definitely agree with that as well.
Yeah. For instance, far from being, she says, indicates here, a neutral blank slates, right? Our minds are predisposed to interpret new data in light of the convictions that we already hold, what we want to be true, right? So we're not neutral and we're not blank, is what she's suggesting. Yet postmodernism typically goes further than this common sense biblical insight into the much more radical, claims that there is no extra mental truth. So it's all, it's all part of what's going on here. It reduces truth claims to social constructions, right? And it reduces individuals to puppets of social forces, she indicates. Yeah. So the implication is that people hold certain ideas not because they have good reasons to hold these ideas, but because they are in a particular community. They're black, they're white, they're a man, they're a woman, Asian, Hispanic, or whatever. Yeah. Right? So that's why people hold these various ideas. She says this is radically dehumanizing. Now, we would think it was just the opposite, right? Well, you're emphasizing the community that the person is in. Right. That seems to be a good thing. She says, no, this is radically dehumanizing. It implies, notice, that individuals are powerless to rise above the communities to which they belong. Right. So they're stuck in this particular community and they can't get out. Right, kind of thing. And so she says this is dehumanizing. It's a form of reductionism that dissolves individual identity into group identity. And the list of group identities keeps growing, right? You have all kinds of things, race, gender, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, your ability, your religion, international status, power differentials, sure. On and on and on and on, right? And so at many universities, the liberal arts departments no longer teach the classics, but immerse students in contemporary works on, for instance, racial or sexual, politics or something like that. Postmodernism, she says, is leagues away from the materialism rampant in the science department, right? But it is equally dehumanizing because materialism reduces humans to products of physical forces, because that's all that exists, right? The physical world. Postmodernism, she says, reduces humans to products of social forces, right? So notice a reductionism is still going on here, right? But it's social forces instead of political forces for postmodernism. So whenever a philosophy absolutizes something less than God, right? No matter what it is, the result is a reductionism, a lower view of the human person. So postmodernists themselves label their view anti-humanism, by which they mean the human subject has no power to transcend social and historical conditions, right? The world, they're stuck in their particular community.
Yeah, which is odd, too, because a big kind of undertaking in the social sciences looking at deviant behavior, and deviant meaning just outside the norm of the expected, what you would expect. And so in that case, there is no deviancy. You're just needing to redraw your circles around the groups of people and community that you're a slave to. And I would say that at some point you're drawing the circles so small that you are individualistic at that point. And I think that would be one of the big problems that we kind of haven't gotten to, because what we're wanting to do now, we as society at large, is there's the want to talk, to speak truth to power. Whatever truth is, it's your truth. Speak and your
whatever
truth.
Power is.
Yeah, and whatever you've made up in your mind is, this is a product of colonialism. The fact that in 1776 America declared its independence, and that has affected us in how we treat the Lower East Side of Detroit's bisexual community that has jeans on, because that's what the product of their environment has told them that they must conform to. Yeah. And so deviant behavior within that would say, well, I don't wear denim jeans, I wear plaid jeans, I don't know, whatever it might be. Yeah. And so then the plaid jeans have to speak truth to power within the denim community. I don't know, but you're always having to redraw these figures unless you want to combine your power together to speak truth to a different power, and you know, unfortunately, I tend to be the most powerful person.
You go, Patrick.
White male, cis male, Christian, all the bad things.
Yeah. So, but she notes, and this is really interesting here. She says, by contrast, Christianity offers a transcendent truth.
Yeah.
So it's not dependent on a particular perspective or a social group or community. It transcends all of that, right? It's a perspective that's not bound by the spirit of the age. It liberates individuals to think critically about what is going on in terms of the spirit of the age. So we're allowed to kind of, Christianity anyway, from view, as it were, as a result of revelation and God, a larger perspective.
Yeah, it's paracultural. I mean, you see it even in the early forms of the church. And if you think that kind of critical race theory is new today, I mean, that's the Roman world was there was no middle class. You were a slave. You were live meal to meal, pole, or you were part of the elite ruling class. There really wasn't a middle class that we have today, where you can kind of have these structures in place to speak different truths to power in certain regards there. And so what you have in the early church is people from all tongue, tribe, nation coming together under the unification of Jesus and the belief that he was the Christ. And it's something that even within Rome you didn't see. You had your gods, and as long as you proclaimed your allegiance to Caesar, then that's fine. Right. But here are people who were really rich and who were slave owners and who were slaves and who ran away from their slave masters, coming to a combined faith, and they worshipped in the same as equals.
Right, and that was the ideal. And of course, there were, the apostles and church leaders had to make sure that happened, and there were some times when it didn't, and so they had to
even among their own.
But that was the ideal. That was what which is different than this idea where we have separate communities, separate groups, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and then you have to structure on a ladder who's the most oppressed. They get the most voice. But I think someone like Ayn Rand type philosophy would speak against this even type of philosophy by having an understanding that the individual is the lowest form of diversification that you could possibly make. All right, so what can we do to critique postmodernism? Because it seems to be such a big thing. Well, one of the big things is we can start with their own view of truth. Postmodernists reject any claim to a truth that is universal, objective, or eternal. They insist that everyone's perspective is situated within a context that is particular, local, and historically contingent. But of course, the same critique applies to postmodernists' own claim. Wow. They too are situated within a particular historical context. After all, where did postmodernism come from? As we have seen, it's an offshoot of modern European culture. White European colonialism.
That's
here. Right. It just goes layers and layers. It stems from post-Hegelian continental philosophy, as Tony mentioned last time, with this notion that individuals are socially constituted by their communities and forms of life. So there's an objective truth that they say permeates through all culture.
Which their system doesn't allow for, because there is no objective truth, right? Each community has their own truth. Right. And truth is determined by intersubjective agreement, is what Richard Rorty says. Yeah. And so notice they're claiming that it's true that there is no truth. Right. There is no universal truth, right? Which is obviously a contradiction.
Yeah, contradiction internally.
It's self-referentially incoherent, we might say. And she'll get to how to evaluate these things, right?
Yeah, part 3.
Yeah.
Postmodernists often accuse Christians of being narrow and closed-minded, but postmodernism is itself confined with these particular strands of Western intellectual history. Thus, postmodernists are just restricted by their own historical horizons as more traditional people whom they tend to look down on. So, again, you have in the West, you have the ability for kind of the fourth wave, I guess, feminism to rise up and say women should be able to go into STEM's field. And, of course, I'm going into a social field, not a STEM's field, to tell other women to go in STEM's field. Well, they have just the privilege of being able to do that their counterparts in, let's say, like the Middle East do not have the ability to. And so it's all about where you're drawing your circles. And so to say that to be able to make the claims that they do is being narrow and closed-minded towards other ways of life that's being done. And again, what they're saying against one thing is to say that group that they're speaking against is doing something that is not correct, that is not right. And so there's a truth claim in and of itself, too.
Yeah, and so, and as she mentioned, you can apply what postmodernism is saying to its own self, right? They are situated within a particular historical context. And so it's them as a group have their ideas of the way things are. And so you can always say, okay, fine, that's the way your group believes or thinks or feels or whatever. Yeah, right.
That's not me.
So who cares about your group? Right?
Yeah.
I care about my group according to postmodernism. And so why even listen to what they say?
Right. You believe in postmodernism. I'm postmodernism prime. Therefore, I should be able to speak truth to your power. In short, the same reasoning that postmodern uses to debunk traditional concepts of truth applies to their own.
Yeah.
But example is Rorty, who argues on the basis of Darwinian evolution that there are no eternal truths, that all our ideas are a product of time and chance, but his conclusions rest on the assumption that Darwin evolution is true, is precisely the sense that he denies that anything can be true.
You cannot say that there are no eternal truths, without, committing a rational suicide by saying it. Right? There's no, that's a claim to be an eternal truth, right? So, yeah.
So the only way it is possible to know eternal truth, of course, is if God has communicated that to the human race, given his own transcendent perspective. That's exactly the earth-shaking claim that Christianity makes. The Scripture is communication from God, giving us information about himself, the cosmos, and history, and it also puts a perspective which all people, all tongues, all tribes, all men, all types of men, all types of people that aren't men, all former sinners who were such were some of you, made into a new creation and made sons and daughters of God. All those types of people can come under a overarching, consistent form of truth with a capital T. Only if God has communicated the infinite reaching down to the finite is it possible to break free, no longer trapped in our individual minds as Enlightenment thinkers were, or trapped in a communal mind as postmodernist thinkers are. A biblical apologetic strategy will equip you to help liberate those who have been taken captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition. It will teach you how to unmask the temporal idols, and that's what she's attempting to do here. So, yes, does postmodernism offer us a good sense that there are differences within different social groups? Absolutely. And you can draw your circles around that. The inner city youth of Chicago has a different perspective than the inner city youth of New York or the inner city youth of Kalamazoo. And there could be shared interests between those two. And so one of those things, looking at the similarities is good, and looking at the differences is also good. But is there overarching truth that can that all humanity can kind of come under and say this is the case? Unfortunately, that's only possible, or fortunately, that's only possible, depending on who you are in this situation, that Christianity offers the most transcendent view of truth.
Good. So that's an explanation and critique of postmodernism.
Yeah.
How about we break here and pick this up
Part 4. All right.
next time,
we're gonna have to.
and go into now look at religions. So she's going to look at a couple of religions for next time.
Sounds good.
All right, good.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.